Putin is getting ready to attend the parade hosted by Xi Jinping. But he's not going alone. He's bringing along his buddy, the North Korean dictator Kim Jong Un. This whole event will take place on September 3rd. But you know what's most important? Putin will meet with the Chinese leader before Trump does. In other words, the groundwork will be laid. And I think we're in for some very serious news after Trump's visit to Xi Jinping. We'll discuss that, of course, a bit later. But for now, let's talk about what might happen at this meeting. Why is it so important for the bunker maniac to meet with his master Xi before meeting with Trump? What could their joint plan be? And we'll also talk about how Hungary is suing the European Union, wanting to overturn the decision to provide aid to Ukraine from the assets of its Russian friends. Germany's leader Merz has stated directly, by the way, we do not want Ukraine to capitulate. This is the common position of Europe, because such a capitulation would give the Russians an opportunity to prepare for a new war with the European Union. Everything is simple, transparent, and clear. All the details are in the segment about what's happening on the international front. Afterwards, we'll break down all the details together with an international expert. My name is Alexander Prepodobny. Let's go.
Putin is heading to a place where he definitely won't be arrested. The Kremlin dictator will travel to China for a full 4 days, where an entertainment program awaits him together with North Korean leader Kim Jong Un.
Putin's meeting with Xi and Kim Jong Un is a story of confrontation with the West and the coalition that was formed by Kyiv around the process of seeking a peaceful solution or a freeze to the war. It's no secret that in the West, Russia is now very often called a vassal of China, and the continuation of the war is generally considered to be one of China's interests. So that's why Putin is going to his master, his senior comrade, to secure support, especially against the backdrop of major economic problems.
It will all begin with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit from August 31 to September 1st, where leaders from more than 20 countries have been invited. And of course, there will be a ceremonial parade which will take place on September 3rd. During the parade, China plans to demonstrate solidarity with Russia and North Korea.
At this point, the survival of the Russian regime directly depends on both economic support and military cooperation, as well as the kind of political leverage that China extends to the Russian Federation. And it is now obvious that the world as a whole has entered a kind of Cold War 2.0, in which the two main superpowers, China and the United States, are confronting each other on various battlefields.
But here's what's interesting. Putin will meet with Xi even before Trump does. Although the US president has stated that he is considering a trip to China itself, which may take place this year or at the beginning of 2026, the purpose of the visit is likely to continue negotiations on a trade agreement.
At this point, it is not advantageous for Xi to meet with Trump. And such a demonstrative refusal to hold this kind of meeting is yet another blow to the foundation of the US as the main geopolitical player and to America's status as the world's policeman. Therefore, I would not jump ahead regarding a potential personal meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump just yet, because it appears quite likely that the People's Republic of China will endeavor to sabotage such a significant initiative from the American president and subsequently utilize this opportunity to substantially increase its own geopolitical gains and strategic advantages.
Meanwhile, there is clearly a labor shortage in Russia. Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service reports that the Kremlin is recruiting women from poor countries to work at its Shahed assembly plants. Then they are doing this through deceitful means.
In South Africa, brick structures were used for recruitment. The Ministry of Women has called on young people to be vigilant. Authorities have launched an investigation into the activities of Russian companies.
Orban is rebelling. Hungary is trying to challenge in court the European Union's decision to use income from frozen Russian assets to finance aid to Ukraine. Back in March 2025, the decision was made bypassing Budapest's opinion.
From a legal standpoint, Hungary can indeed use the argument that the decision was made without their participation, given the legal norms of the European Union. But there is also a political aspect, which in this matter is even more important. At the moment, there are indeed quite active discussions in the heart of Europe about reformatting or reforming the decision-making process. At this point, it is obvious to everyone that Hungary and Slovakia are directly playing into Russia's hands.
On the night of August 28th, Russia launched another attack on Kyiv using drones and missiles. There are reports of casualties and fatalities.
We are awaiting China's response to what is happening. China has repeatedly called for the war not to be expanded and for a ceasefire. This is not happening because of Russia. We are awaiting a response from Hungary. The death of children should evoke far stronger emotions than anything else. We expect a response from everyone in the world who has called for peace, but now remains silent more often than taking a principled stand.
But the one who truly understands Russia's intentions is the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz. He stated that Germany does not want Ukraine to capitulate, as that would only give Russia time to prepare for its next act of aggression.
Petro Oleszczuk, a political scientist, is joining our broadcast. Petro, hello, we're glad to see you.
Hello.
Let's talk about Putin going to the parade with Xi Jinping. Apparently, he is supposed to bring Kim Jong Un along with him. Tell me, please, what does this gathering of dictators in one place mean? I'll also add some general information. At the parade, Robert Fico is expected to attend, as well as the president of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić. Well, Fico is the prime minister of Slovakia, for those who don't know. Alexander Lukashenko, of course, who calls himself the president of Belarus and also the president of Iran, the president of Indonesia, and the speaker of the National Assembly of South Korea. So, what does all of this mean? Would you be so kind as to explain, please?
It's the League of Evil, the axis of evil in full assembly. You know, like in the classic and incredibly popular old comedy film Austin Powers, where the nefarious and truly diabolical Dr. Evil would meticulously gather all the various supervillains and carefully seat them around one very large and imposing table accordingly. Well, you know, in reality, it's truly kind of the profound crystallization of what we've long and consistently called the infamous axis of evil. But most often, the term axis of evil is widely and commonly used as a sort of journalistic phrase, as if there's this powerful and dangerous axis of evil that fundamentally opposes the free world, and so on and so forth, and so on. But in reality, it's not just a figure of speech. It's a reality, and it's a reality that all these actors clearly feel. And obviously, they really are ready to act as a kind of united front. And the presence of Fico here is, of course, the most interesting fact, since Slovakia is a member of the European Union, and most importantly, a member of NATO. That is an organization that, in theory, is supposed to contain the influence of this so-called axis of evil, but for some reason isn't really doing much to contain it. And the very presence, in fact, of figures like Fico among NATO leaders shows that NATO and the West as a whole have some rather serious problems. So yes, the axis of evil is uniting, consolidating, while Trump, let's say, isn't exactly destroying Western unity, but is constantly putting it into question and under threat. And this raises a question. Yes, the question is, what in fact will happen in the future when this very axis of evil, which has a single goal, what is it that actually unites all these people? Very different people from different parts of the world who seemingly have nothing in common, opposition to the West. That is, they hate the West, want to destroy it, want to destroy democracy and its corresponding values, and for the sake of this, they are ready to unite with each other, despite fundamental differences in many respects. And isn't this a reason for the West to reflect what in fact awaits it tomorrow?
Honestly, when I read this list, I double-checked to make sure. The Speaker of the National Assembly of South Korea, Woo Won-shik. So, South Korea, does that mean they will be standing next to Kim Jong Un? Is that normal now? What about South Korea, the Western world, their close friendship, their support for Ukraine with artillery shells and all that? Or is there some nuance here that we've missed?
They didn't help Ukraine with artillery shells. They sold some of their shells to the United States. That's it. Because it's a matter of principle for South Korea that they do not provide Ukraine with military or any other kind of assistance. There was some kind of humanitarian aid, but that was under the previous government and the previous president who held a more, let's say, right-wing conservative position. But now the former president of South Korea is on trial. The newly elected president is left-wing, probably one of the most left-leaning presidents in South Korea's history. He came to power with the idea of resetting relations with North Korea, with the help of Russia, by the way. In other words, his program includes establishing good relations with Russia and China so that they can help South Korea reset and improve relations with North Korea so that there will be peace, friendship, and harmony. Personally, I think this is the height of absurdity in the current situation. When North Korea is becoming as militarized as possible with Russia's support, improving its missile production technologies, testing its own army in real combat conditions, in short, they are genuinely preparing for war. But at the same time, there was this sort of leftist episode in South Korea, which is reflected, among other things, in actions like these and in attempts to sit on two chairs at once. They won't be able to pull it off, but in reality, this is quite a dramatic and compelling story, especially considering the significant and overarching role South Korea currently plays in the broader Western world as a crucial bearer of cutting-edge technology, a prominent leader in advanced manufacturing methods, and a key developer of innovative production tools.
Piotr, let's sum it up. The key point for us is that Putin will meet with Xi Jinping, and their buddy Kim will also be there. And together, they need to develop some kind of common position regarding Trump. Because after this meeting, Trump will meet with Xi Jinping. So tell me, what do you expect? Well, not exactly provocations, but what conditions or demands do you think China will put forward to Trump when he meets with Xi Jinping?
Well, China's strategic interest, of course, is that Russia should not leave China's sphere of influence under any circumstances. In fact, the continuation of the current war against Ukraine is part of this plan. So, the war continues, there is no reset, Russia keeps separating itself from the West and accordingly aligns itself with China. And in principle, everything is going perfectly for China in this regard. And naturally, Trump, with his ideas of resetting relations with Russia and ending the war in Ukraine as soon as possible, probably doesn't quite fit into these plans. But at the very same time, the People's Republic of China may not openly contradict or directly challenge Trump's ambitious plans. I think the Chinese government might simply enjoy subtly manipulating this complex topic, giving Trump a significant amount of hope, which, as practical experience and historical evidence clearly show, is entirely baseless and utterly unfounded, that he can genuinely win the enduring friendship of Vladimir Putin, and that Putin will ultimately switch his primary allegiance from being a steadfast friend and close ally of China to becoming a loyal and dedicated friend of Trump. And in reality, China is clearly manipulating this. And we see how, from time to time, there seem to be some breakthroughs in relations between Russia and the United States. But then all of this is quickly disavowed and it starts all over again. So essentially, we see how China, using Russia, is playing a cat and mouse game with the United States. It's as if they're constantly giving hope that a reset is just about to happen and then rolling everything back again. It's hard to say whether any stable agreements between China and the US are possible in this situation. Because on the one hand, China is not interested in any kind of economic escalation with the United States, but it's clear that China has its own plans, which ultimately still come into conflict with the interests of the United States. But Russia is not an independent factor here, and we can see that very clearly. And by the way, all attempts to somehow reset relations between the United States and Russia fail precisely because of this. That is, the United States clearly does not quite correctly assess the extent of Russia's involvement in China's geopolitical project.
Piotr, there's something else I'd like to discuss with you. The attack on Kiev that took place last night. Let me remind our audience that already 20 people have died, well, 19. They are reporting that people are still being searched for under the rubble. So unfortunately, it's clear that the statistics may get worse. Let's hope that doesn't happen. So this night was very frightening. The Russians once again launched missiles, drones, and everything they could. In Russia, this attack was called a success. That is, military targets and the like were hit. Keith Kellogg, Trump's envoy on the Russia-Ukraine war, responded by saying that this is supposedly how the Russians see peace. Well, at least it's good that he pointed that out. But still, is Trump actually capable of doing something after this, changing his position, adjusting it? Or will we see something like, Vladimir makes me so angry. Vladimir, why do you make me so angry? You've killed so many dozens of Ukrainians in the center of Kiev. What is your assessment and forecast?
It's telling that only Keith Kellogg responded, and even then, not right away. At the same time, we should understand that Keith Kellogg is not an official government figure. He's not the Secretary of State, not the Vice President, not a member of the administration. He's, let's say, a representative of Trump in a public capacity. So yes, he probably can communicate with Trump and tell him things, but that's about it. But all the official structures of the United States did not react at all. Today I spent the whole day checking the United States Embassy in Ukraine's page on X, and they didn't post anything at all. Nothing. In other words, they completely ignored it. Although you'd think, if not now, then when should they react? So it's clear that they're continuing down the path of silence and ignoring the issue. And it's obvious that Trump will act in the same way. Honestly, I don't know whether he'll comment on it now or not. Maybe he doesn't plan to comment at all and will just go play golf over the weekend. So honestly, it doesn't look like there will be any reaction from the United States. In other words, Trump thinks he's already reached an agreement with Putin and now it just needs to be formalized. Let others handle the formalities. But in reality, statements from Russia, particularly what Lavrov has been saying lately, show that Russia doesn't believe it has reached any agreements with the United States. At all, in general. By the way, today Peskov also emphasized that there were no agreements about a ceasefire in the sky. So really, what's the problem? We're continuing military operations. This is quite an unambiguous challenge to the Trump administration, but Trump isn't going to respond to this. In other words, Trump believes that a deal is close, that it's just a little bit more and everything will be settled. And accordingly, he will proceed from this very paradigm. So he's not going to do or say anything. So again, if we hear anything, it will just be some vague, meaningless statements.
All right, let's discuss one more thing before we finish. There was a statement that, for example, the Hungarians are now very eager to sue the European Union in order to overturn the decision to provide aid to Ukraine from the funds that were frozen by the European Union. I mean, Russian assets. Tell us, this figure Orban, can he actually influence such decisions right now? And how is his position shifting at the moment? At one point, he was extremely angry with Zelensky after the shelling of the Druzhba oil pipeline, and then, as was reported, the European Union apparently managed to persuade Hungary not to veto, for example, Ukraine's accession to the EU. Please comment on Orban's current position and his influence.
For now, for the time being, Orban is clearly hoping to achieve his goals solely through blackmail and exerting pressure. In other words, he hopes that by showing his strength now, so to speak, Ukraine will back down, and he will continue to maintain excellent relations with Russia, receiving money, oil, and everything else Hungary needs from Russia, while at the same time blocking any decisions in the European Union that are important for Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine has a different opinion, and accordingly strikes on the Druzhba oil pipeline will continue. For now, Sijarto claims that they have supposedly found some kind of workaround. Well, if this workaround is also eliminated, then sooner or later Hungary will face a choice. Either continue escalating with Ukraine or try to find some kind of compromise with Ukraine. To be completely honest, I genuinely do not know which specific path the current Orban government will ultimately take, but in any and all cases, it is abundantly clear that Ukraine has finally and decisively found the crucial button, pressing which can actually and significantly influence Orban and his administration. That is, many times people have tried to persuade Orban to negotiate and solve certain problems, but all of that was useless, because in any case, Russia could always offer Orban more. That was the only thing Orban cared about, who would give him more, and Putin always gave more. Accordingly, things didn't work out with Orban in a friendly way. Let's see what happens, so to speak, if things go the hard way. So far, the initial results truly seem quite encouraging to me, primarily because the significant hysteria that has clearly broken out within Orban's government vividly demonstrates that, in reality, this situation is proving to be very, very painful and deeply impactful for them. If they don't find a way to rein in Ukraine in the near future, then one way or another, I think they'll have to enter into some substantive negotiations with Ukraine on the question of how to coexist going forward and how to resolve the problems that exist. In reality, Ukraine doesn't need much from Hungary, just that it doesn't block the process of European integration, doesn't block the allocation of aid to Ukraine, and doesn't block anti-Russian sanctions. So, in fact, none of this directly concerns any Hungarian financial or other interests. It's simply what Orban promised Putin in exchange for the same oil and other perks. And accordingly, if Orban stops receiving Putin's oil, then what reason does he have to serve Putin's interests? So, well, I think this story isn't over yet. There will be many more episodes in this whole situation. So let's wait and see.
We'll keep an eye on this. And now, at the very, very end, let's discuss the position of Merz, who recently stated, Friedrich Merz, that Ukraine's capitulation is merely an opportunity for Putin to prepare for a new war with Europe. Tell me, please, do you currently see a clear position from the European Union on this issue? Or let me put it this way, to what extent does Friedrich Merz's position currently resonate with the majority of decision-makers in Europe?
Well, you see, Europe, as always, is not united. That is, there will always be someone in Europe who opposes a unified position. We've already mentioned Orban, we've mentioned Fico, And there are other countries as well, other governments where there are also rather controversial figures. And because of this lack of unity, Europe cannot play the role of a subject in global politics. Because on the face of it, there are resources, there is money, and the demographics allow for a claim to the status of a world power. But in reality, there is no status as a world power. Why is that? Because there is no unity. And so naturally, Merz's position is important because one way or another, Germany is still the leading country in Europe, whether someone wants to admit it or not. There is no more significant economy, no more significant military-industrial complex. Germany is Germany. What more is there to say? And the leader of Germany, accordingly, is not exactly the leader of Europe, but rather the leader of Europe. And that's why, naturally, his position is significant. But we have to understand that in Europe, there are too many forces that are not interested in Europe having its own agency. And secondly, disunity always works against Europe actually playing the geopolitical role that it can and should count on.
Thank you very much. Petro Oleszczuk, political scientist, was on air with Ukraine today. All the best to you, Petro. Take care of yourself. Goodbye.
Well, goodbye for now, my friend, for a while until we meet again.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.